one study didn't replicate, and that's why I started looking into it further. So anyway, so that's how we kind of got kicked out for this, us vigorously debating power posing. But I think it's a great question about like, okay, if you care about science producing like true, useful things, like how can you get it to do more of it, and why is it not doing more of it right now? And so one partial answer to that question is that I think finding true, useful things is like a very brittle process, in the sense that there's like maybe 10 things that can go wrong in that process, and they're unfortunately like fairly independent. And so like to produce true, useful things reliably, you have to like get every one of those parts to work, and if they don't, then you kind of go off the rails. And so what are some of those parts? Well, you have to start by working on a problem that actually matters. Now, okay, maybe you'll get really lucky and be studying something that seems totally useless, like number theory, and it turns out to work for cryptography. But the reality is that almost never happens. Like those are like the weird special cases that we hear about. But the vast majority of the time, if you're studying like the slime on a snail, like it's not going to turn out to be a cure for cancer. It's just going to be slime on a snail. And so, but that's just like the first thing that has to go right. You have to like pick a topic that matters. You also have to actually have a strategy for like answering questions about it that's like might actually work. You have to not produce false positives on that question. You have to like actually figure out the truth about it. But even that is not enough. Those truths have to be something that can be convertible into like some application, right? Like so you might have an interesting truth, but maybe nobody knows how to convert to something useful. Even if it's convertible in theory to something useful, someone has to actually go do that process of converting to something useful. Usually there's a translation process to put in the real world. And then even if it's translated in the real world, like someone has to go market it, like and get it out there, spread it around. And and these steps don't happen automatically. And this is where I have this phrase I like to use, which is full stack social science, which is an analogy to full stack software engineering. Full stack software engineers are dealing with like all the different parts of the system. And when I think about full stack social science, it's like you're trying to take things from the very beginning of like hypothesis generation or exploring hypotheses others have generated all the way to a product that's out there in the world and ideally is like positively affecting the lives of millions of people. And because I believe in the brittleness of this process, that's why I feel like why my company, Sparkwave, is designed to try to do like that full stack of things. And so what we do is we come up with ideas for products that we think could be beneficial to the world. We specialize in social science kind of applications, and we only work in software. That's just our medium that we're experts in. And then we look at the hypotheses that academics have come up with. We develop our own hypotheses. We look at studies done by others. We run our own studies, and then we try to take those all the way, all the way to trying to actually help people. And so, just to give you some examples of this, one of them is Uplift, which is our automated app to try to help people cure their own depression. And so that project started with a literature review, trying to say what is known about how depression can be cured. It turns out, like by far the therapy with the most evidence for doing that is cognitive behavioral therapy. Doesn't mean it's the only one that's effective, but if you had to pick one based on the amount of evidence, it's the one with the most evidence. So we started there, and then you can also ask the question like, well, what can be computerized, what can be done automatically? And so we spent a lot of time looking into that. It turns out there's actually a lot of studies on what's computerizable, so that was really helpful. And then we looked at what solutions people had created, what are the digital solutions that trying to give people automated cognitive behavioral therapy, or what are the weaknesses, and then all that information went into our plan, and then we spent a long time to try to execute that plan. And yeah, we built this app, Uplift, which our goal is to make it the best automated app for depression in the world, to try to actually help you cure your depression. Another way to think about it is like, why do self-help books suck, and what would they look like if they didn't suck? Well, I would argue they would be based on evidence. They would be targeting specific problems, not just general, like, I'm going to improve your life. They would be customized. They would just be like, everyone reads the same series of sentences in the same order. They should adapt to what you're doing. They should be able to check in on you and remind you of things. They should be able to teach you skills and then check that you know those skills by testing you and reminding you of those skills, etc. So that's basically what we're trying to create. So that's one example. We've tried to go the full way. There's a bunch of other things that we're doing, like we run Clearer Thinking, which I don't know if you guys have checked that out, clearerthinking.org. Basically what we do there is we take ideas from social science and some of our own ideas and try to build them into kind of fun, entertaining, either assessments or tools or training programs that you can do to learn something about yourself, about bias. So example would be like we have a module on the planning fallacy to try to help people reduce the planning fallacy. That's one of our least fun ones. We have a self-assessment that is kind of a fun rationality test that tries to get you thinking about what are your weaknesses in rationality and then we try to direct your resources where maybe you can improve your different rationality skills. We have about 22 free programs on our site you can do. So that's another example of like kind of our applied social science. And then some of the stuff we do is trying to go really deeper at the really develop new hypotheses. And that's sort of newer work we're doing, but something that I'm excited about. So
like I'll get to SparkWave and to clearthinking.org. I have some questions about that.
Sure.
So I want to stay on psychology for a minute.
Yeah, let's talk about it.
And I want to like bring the mood down and be a bit pessimistic.
Please.
So I looked at Spencer's data, and there's an effect size of 0.2 for power posing effect in self-reported mode. And okay, so psychologists right now, they're running like a bunch of studies, and instead of running crap studies, they could run good studies, like the one you did, and they find 20 effects like this and get to name it after themselves, or find like cool names for them, the Ariely effect, the pizza effect, all kinds. And this doesn't feel to me like science. So, said power posing, you feel it strongly. So like maybe it works for you, but not for other people. So it works for 20% of people, but okay, and even if you find out what it correlates with, I'm not sure it adds up to anything. It's just a bunch of anecdotes. So it's part of some general theory of embodied cognition, but embodied cognition isn't really a theory. The only thing, there's like some interesting thing that it says, which are probably not true, and one true thing that it says, which is your body affects your brain, which is obvious and not interesting. And which is like you're doing a lot to help kind of make those studies where like you take 100 college graduates, you run some data, you at least don't p-hack, you measure an actual effect. Do you think those will eventually add up to an actual science of psychology with important principles, or is it just gonna stay a level of disjointed effects, which in the best case can like come up with a small intervention that will help some people, and the worst case don't really add up too much?
Yeah, and it's a really good question. And I think of the process of trying to like do applied social science research is very different from trying to do theoretical social science research, where you're trying to build a theory of like some part of human psychology. So I'll after our depression app, like if that works, and I think that it does, then I view it as like much more than just like a little intervention that's slightly helpful. I view it as like hopefully life-changing for some people. So to me, that's an example where like I get excited about like, okay, we don't understand human psychology broadly, but maybe we understand enough about depression that we can really help people who are suffering to a very large degree. So that's an example. But let me give you another example, which is, so something we've been working on for a long time is a study on habit formation. And there's a question of, suppose you want to form a new habit, what should you actually do? And we looked at the academic literature, and we did some crowdsourcing, we did some brainstorming, and we found a lot of different micro interventions for habit formation. We're running a study right now where we actually are testing 21 different micro interventions for habit formation, pitting them against each other in a crazy study design where we actually randomize people, and people get 5 out of the 21 picked at random, and we track them for a month to see if they stick to their habits. Now, these interventions are all like, they're like pretty dumb things. Like they're really obvious things. Like, okay, one of them is like tell a friend that you want to form the habit, right? Another one is like write on a note card like that you like the habit and put it somewhere where you're going to see it over and over again. Others are like think of the reason why you might fail at doing this habit and like come up with a plan in advance, right? None of these are groundbreaking or particularly interesting. But our question is there some package of them that like substantially improves the chance that you stick to a habit? Like there's a real value in developing an exercise habit or a healthy eating habit, right? This really could be life-changing. Now, I don't think any of these interventions on their own is going to be that powerful, but could we find a series of 6 of them that together as a bundle, increases your chance of sticking to your habit 30%, and maybe that will actually have a huge impact on people's lives? That would be great. I don't know because we're not done running the study, but that's the kind. So I think there's like potentially a lot of promise there, and part of that comes from testing a bunch of things. Part of it comes from stacking. Like if you get a bunch of things that each work 5%, you can stack them on top of each other potentially. So that's one side of it, like the applied side. On the theoretical side, I totally agree with you that it's very hard to go from like all these little fun studies about embodied cognition or whatever to like some grand theory. And so you can ask the question, like, are we really making progress, or are we just learning these little cute
we've
facts?
walked around. Like depression's a huge problem.
Yeah.
So we poked around like, okay, we know CBT works, but like we don't understand depression. And
I
like,
think we
there's
know,
a lot of other
yeah.
therapies and they all work kind of the same, and they don't get better as a therapist gets more experience. So it's like,
Well, that's an interesting question of like the degree to which different therapies work, and we could get into that. It's a whole complicated thing. I think we do understand quite a bit about depression. Like, maybe you and I disagree on that. For example, I think we know that depression very often involves a sense of hopelessness about the future or a sense of valuelessness of the self. I think that we have some ideas of some like behavioral patterns that depressed people tend to have that tend to promote the depression, and that if you can go and like inject an intervention at the right point to interrupt that pattern, that can be really helpful. So I think we do know like a lot of things about depression that are useful in developing powerful interventions. And I don't think all therapies are equal. I think that having a supportive person just to talk to gets you some effect size for a lot of people, right? Like, so I don't think that's useless, but I don't think that's as good as like the best state-of-the-art things we know about depression. Yeah.
Just a quick question.
Yeah.
So it sounds like your approach is looking for something that works well across the general population versus like accounting for any kinds of individual quirks. Because a lot of, say, what's going on in the medical community is looking at the genetic data and saying, okay, because these people share these genetic factors, then, okay, some things are going to work better for them versus other things are not.
Yeah, that's a great question. The way I think about it is like it's often useful to start with things that work well on average, and I think in many cases in psychology we're not even there yet. Like, like our goal, for example, with Uplift is to be something that works really well on average for people with depression. Would we like to customize it to you? Well, it already does a bunch of like micro customization based on like what you're dealing with at the moment and things like that. Would we like to do more macro customization? Maybe we could predict things about your depression and treat you differently. Yes, we'd love to do that, but that requires a lot of data, and we're just trying to make the thing that works well on average first. But let me give you an example where I think customization is absolutely essential, which is sleep problems. So if you look at sleep problems, there's so many different interventions, and my prediction would be that almost any of those interventions, if you were to study it on 200 people with sleep problems, you find it doesn't work very well. Why? Because sleep problems are varied. Like, people have different problems when they say sleep problems, right? And so, for example, using earplugs can be super valuable if you live in a noisy environment and worthless if you don't. And so one thing we're doing is we're actually trying to work on sleep problems, and our approach to this is the sort of complete customized approach, which is that we have sleep intervention, and what it does is it asks you a long series of questions and tries to figure out, based on them, which of the 20 plus sleep interventions might actually be appropriate for you, recommends the ones it thinks is most appropriate, then tries to convince you to commit to actually trying 2 of them. And that's our intervention. So we're actually running a randomized control trial right now on that. And so the intervention is this super customized thing that could involve a whole different, every person's going to get kind of a different set of recommendations. So in some cases, I think it's essential. And in fact, if the state of the art is that all we have is a bunch of interventions that help different people, there's nothing else you can do, right? Like, if each intervention only helps 10% of people, you're out of luck unless you can do the customization. Yeah.
I would like to know more about your controlled trial framework. It sounds pretty magical, right? The power posing, you said you were larger than all the researchers combined, which is pretty amazing.
Yeah, so basically, we largely do 2 things. We apply social science, and the other thing we do is we build technology for social science. And so we built a new platform for recruiting people for studies, which we use to run our studies. And we built another platform for building complex interventions and also for building complex studies. And we use it to build our stuff. And so that's how we do our studies. So I don't know if you have any more specific questions about
do you
how that
worry
works.
about selection bias because you've got this platform which is recruiting people?
So selection bias of what form? That it's non-representative of the population?
Well, for example, if you go on the internet and you do an internet poll, you'll get people who are on the internet.
Yeah. Totally. So it depends on your goals. So one of the nice things is, so we're Clear Thinking. We have a mailing list of about 37,000 people now, and that's actually large enough that we can actually run studies on our own users, which is amazing because we can then take what we learn and then apply it to our own users. And so we don't have to be claiming that like it works for every single person. Now I think that often it is true. Like if we build our sleep intervention, it works for people on our mailing list. I think there's a good chance it will work for a lot of people with sleep problems. But this is one way we help solve the generalizability problem, is that we can test things on our own audience now. And so for our habit formation study, we were able to recruit a few hundred people doing a study for a month from our own mailing list. And then we supplemented that with what people from our platform, because we actually wanted a larger sample size because we wanted to get over 500. The selection bias and generalizability problem is definitely a problem. But like a lot of times people say, oh, the way to try to solve it is to try to like somehow figure out that the thing is truly generalizable to all humans. But another way to solve it is like say, well, which humans are actually going to be using your result? Like, let's make sure it works on them, because that's actually the most important thing, right?
The power posing, I think, was Mechanical Turkers and Spencer's Facebook friends, which included me, and power posing does nothing for me. So it means it's more effective for Mechanical Turkers on average, since there is an effect size. Okay, I want to jump ahead to a different topic, which is effective altruism.
Yeah.
So a lot of us are familiar with effective altruism thus far, can quickly Google it on their phone. There's a few main cause areas that people are interested in.
Mm-hmm.
And some of the popular ones are existential risk, worried about unfriendly AI, pandemics, things that like extinction level events for humanity.
Mm-hmm.
People are worried about poverty, and especially helping people in developing countries with health and poverty interventions, like malaria nets, and people are worried about animal welfare, so ending factory farming. Now, all of those things, I know you're familiar with them and definitely care about them, weren't chosen at random. So effective altruism uses three main criteria for choosing what to do, which are neglectedness, tractability, and impact.
Mm-hmm.
So I know you're familiar with all those core areas, and you've chosen, at least in terms of your direct work, to focus not on any of them, but on mental health. Which seems...
Well, I'd say social science, but mental health is a subset,
So it seems not to be very neglected. It seems, you can't really make a lot of money right now by preventing human extinction or caring about animal suffering, so not a lot of people work with it, but a lot of people are trying to do social science, figure out mental health, and it seems like the tractability is also up in question. The impact could be pretty big. So just curious why you're focusing on that, and if you think it's just a good fit for you, or you want to convince us that it's actually something we should all care more about.
Well,
as part of effective altruism.
I certainly would not argue it's more important than those other areas. And I care a lot about those areas, and I do a little bit of work in them. But you're right, that's not my main focus. That being said, I do think that social science has massive potential to help the world. And I'll just try to make a pitch. I'm not trying to convince anyone because I don't want you to stop working on those other things. But here's a pitch. Okay, so first of all, let's just consider depression, which is just one small, tiny little part of social science, right? So depression, the general estimates are about 1 in 12 people have clinical depression. Now, I don't know if you've ever had depression or had a close loved one who had it, but it's fucking terrible. And clinical depression is a pretty severe level. Way more people than that have a mild form of depression. It's hard to know how many because now we're not talking about things that have a really standardized definition. But I think by some estimates, depression is one of the largest sources of suffering in the world. There certainly have been estimates that it's the leading or second leading cause of disability in the world. Even just in economic terms, it's pretty insane the economic impacts of it, because think about how much it lowers productivity. And if you're lowering productivity for 1 in 12 people, but maybe more people than that because of people mildly depressed. So you start just calculating out the amount of suffering and loss that comes about from depression. Also, depression causes suffering for the loved ones of people who are depressed. If you've ever been really close to someone who's really depressed, it's very difficult in a lot of ways. It's also a leading loss of life for young males, for example, from suicide. So if you add all that up, you're actually the amount of badness caused by depression is pretty insanely large. Is it tractable? Well, I think it is, in the sense that I think that our understanding of how to help people with depression is much greater than our current solutions out there in the world, and that's what inspired Uplift. Is we think we can build the best product in the world for this. Is it neglected? It's not neglected in the sense that lots of people talk about depression, but I think what's neglected is the number, sort of trying to take a strategic approach and say what will be the highest impact way to get the best quality version of this out in the world. I think that is relatively neglected. Okay, so that's depression. That's one little tiny subtopic. Let me talk another topic in social science, which I think is massively important, which is behavior change. Being able to change human behavior at scale, like through a digital intervention, I think just has insane potential to do good. Everything from like improving health, like, you know, if you could get people to be healthier eaters or exercise more by creating so what I'm talking about behavior change here is really a person wants to do a thing, but they're not doing it, right? And we know this is like a cause of so many bad things in the world, right? What if you could help them do the thing that they want to do on like an intellectual level? And I think there's a lot of potential there. Like, there are a lot of people working on it in different ways. But again, I think that there's opportunities to try to build like best in class things. Like, for example, with our habit study, to go back to that, like, our hope is that we can build the best in class tool to help you form a new habit, because as far as I can tell, there's pretty much nobody out there who's like testing 21 habit formation techniques against each other. There might be, I don't know, if I'd love to find out about them if they exist, but so I basically, what I would say about this is I think social science contains these incredibly important problems, and while there are many people working around them, I see strategies that I think are all this stuff is hard, like has a high probability of failure, all the stuff I'm talking about, but I see strategies that I think like don't seem that unlikely to work, that actually could have massive benefits. And those are just two areas. I mean, there's a lot of others, like sleep problems. I think social science can work on. That's massive. Anxiety is super massive. It's like the largest class of disorders that exist. Productivity, right? People talk about like increasing technology to increase productivity. What if you could increase productivity more directly through social science, right? Like, okay, maybe that sounds a little wacky, but like if we actually believed in psychology, maybe we'd be like, oh wait, psychologists could actually make us, like, they could make all of society 1% more effective, right? Like, but I think a lot of people don't believe that. And going back, I think you asked a really interesting question which I didn't really get into, which is like, okay, but can you really develop like better theories of psychology from like all these little bits and pieces? And I think that process could potentially also yield really large value. I think there's surprisingly few people trying to develop these like overarching theories of psychology. Like, I think it's just not a very cool thing to try to do. And if you look at psychologists, they tend to be hyper specialized. They're find an expert in PTSD. Like, that's not even anxiety. That's like a specific subtype of anxiety. And you talk to an expert in PTSD and you ask them about something about OCD, and they'll be like, well, I think this, but you should really go talk to an expert in OCD, which is another anxiety disorder, right? So I think there's very few people trying to develop these overarching theories, and it's something that we're getting into more and more recently, but we're just beginning to do inroads and like saying, well, what would it look like to develop these larger theories of psychology? What could you do to try to develop them faster, more aimed at doing good and like producing novel interventions. So we have one relatively new project we're working on for about a year, which is we want to develop novel interventions in anxiety. Things that nobody has ever tried that might actually work better than other stuff that people have tried to improve anxiety. And our approach to doing that is we started asking the question, what are all the ways you can develop hypotheses in social science? And then we've got this super long list, and now we've got ways to develop hypotheses, and then we kind of view this long list of methods as a tool belt, and we're like, okay, our tool belt has 22 tools on it. Which tool do we want to use first? And then just trying to go through those tools of like hypothesis generation with the goal of eventually hopefully developing kind of novel treatments for anxiety. So, right. Yeah.
Sick of habit formation, by the way. So 2 weeks ago, I ran a workshop on trigger action planning, which is Cipher's chosen technique for habit formation. So who here was at the TAP workshop 2 weeks ago? I see 3 hands up. Out of those 3, how many people are doing their TAPs 2 weeks later?
Yes.
I didn't commit to any.
Alright, so that is 1 out of 3. So there's kind of like an interesting thing happening in the rationality community, which is a lot of the content and less wrong.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people write about the Center for Applied Rationality is kind of self-help. It's the idea like read this, practice this, talk with a friend who will help you like figure this out, and you will think better, you will be less biased, you will change your habits.
Mm-hmm.
And then like you have very smart people like Scott Alexander, like the most famous rationalist writer right now, somebody who seems to be very smart and rational, and he's extremely skeptical of it. It's like writing articles unless wrong why none of the shit basically works. And we had people who showed up to learn about taps, and everyone was super excited as we finished the session, and I even assigned people accountability buddies, and we have a success rate of like 30%. Like Nathan stuck with it and Alex stuck a little bit with mine, and I'm the one who did it. So I want to hear like the clear thinking org is basically like the flag at the far side of the spectrum, which is like not only can we improve your thinking, we can do it with this like fun 21 question game. So like, what's the view from that side?
Yeah. So So first of all, I love Scott Alexander's writing. I think he's awesome and brilliant. I definitely disagree with him on this topic. Which maybe means I'm wrong, but I'll tell you why. See what you think. So first of all, what really inspired me around rationality is just like using it to myself and seeing the practical differences. And this was a disturbing experience I once had at a rationality meetup where people went around, for some reason, someone was like, let's go around the room and talk about how rationality has improved our lives. And we go around the room, and I see a bunch of the people there struggling to come up with one thing. And I was like, what? I was like, are you kidding me? Like, it's so easy for me to name like concrete, practical ways that rationality improves my life. And so that really got me, that's like how I was initially inspired to be like, okay, there's some disconnect here. Like, this stuff is really useful, and I see that in my daily life. I see specific things that I was like about to make that mistake and then I didn't in many, many ways. Like, something about the translation process is going wrong, of like people aren't figuring out how to use it. For example, I found out that people don't use Bayes' rule that often in their daily life. The heck? Like a lot of people who understand it on a conceptual level, but isn't down to the level of like something that they know how to do in a specific case for things they care about that come up in the real world, right? Not that they couldn't theoretically do it, but like it's not actually happening. So that gets me inspired. It's very hard to change human behavior, and so that's one of the things I'm like, that's the holy grail I'm after, is like, can you change human behavior digitally at scale? I'm not going to go claim that like, you're going to do one assessment and your life is going to be totally altered. But I do think that there's a lot of potential here. So let me give you some examples. So planning fallacy. So many times I have improved my estimates of how long a project will take or how much it will cost because I'm aware of the planning fallacy. It's not to say that I don't fall for it. I certainly do, but I fall for it way less than I used to. And how do I know that? Because literally at the moment I'm making the estimate, I'm like, planning fallacy, and then I adjust my estimate, and then I see it probably still at an underestimate, but it's like significantly less than it would have been, right? Sunk cost fallacy, similar, like, just noticing this pattern and be like, is this the sunk cost fallacy that's happening here in my life? Anchoring in negotiations, when you see someone had thrown out a particular number, 15%, and you're beginning to see your mind like start to work around that number, and then you're like, oh, wait, hold on, like, let's come up with a number a completely different way rather than starting at that starting point. So I see these opportunities all over the place. Or, Bayes' rule comes up for me, especially when I'm thinking about some piece of evidence occurred and I'm thinking about, okay, is that strong evidence, is that moderate evidence, is that weak? That's the times I usually use it. And sometimes evidence, it's my first gut reaction is like, oh, maybe that's really strong. And I'm like, but is it really strong? And I like do that double check for the strength of evidence. Or, neglect of small probabilities, like just thinking about like, okay, what could be really detrimental to my company that has never happened before, but like given what I know about the world, like actually, could be a thing that happens. So like, I just feel like I have so many examples of these where they're so pragmatic. So clear thinking is my attempt to try to like bring this to more people. We also do other stuff besides like bias and rationality stuff. Like we, for example, have a thing called Tactics for Happier Living, where we analyze your happiness and help you kind of try to come up with strategies around ways that you're less happy and maybe could become more happy. Or so we have we have a program on savoring, about how to savor more and like things like that. But yeah, we do have a big emphasis on like rational thinking in different forms.
Right.
Yeah.
So like I had a crazy schedule today, and I arrived here sharp at 7:29, and so like I figured out planning fallacy.
Yeah.
And so like, but maybe this is kind of my view, is that it's like 101 stuff. It's like all the biases that on the Wikipedia list of biases, anchoring and that. Like, they're not really interesting. So you have
You have to be aware.
You know,
You have to be aware of interesting things.
things that people interpreting evidence in their own way. People thinking in tribal ways.
Yeah.
People, like, an important deep questions, like, and the biggest problems in their lives, instead of looking for the truth, they, like, think what would be nice, what would be political.
Right.
Basically all the stuff that rationalists have been writing about for like the past 7-8 years, after we're like, okay, anchoring, fine, we've got anchoring.
Yeah, so I mean that's a good question. I think that stuff. I think a bunch of that stuff is useful, but the question is how to use it. And like, so if you think about bias, very often what needs to happen to resolve it is that when you're going about your business, there's some moment where you have to have a different thought than you would have had.
Interrupt.
Yeah. And so what that means is either the thought that is sort of the biased thought doesn't happen, but I think more often it still does happen, but you have this like override that occurs. And to have that override, you have to like notice that the thing had just happened. You have to know a strategy to override it. You have to be motivated to use that strategy, right? So that's how I think about it. And how do you actually install the pattern recognition to notice that the bias is at play? How do you teach the actual counter strategy? And then how do you motivate people to care enough to do it, right? And so even knowing, like, is it really, really useful, like, knowing about some of the rationale stuff? Yes, but, like, that doesn't mean you've automatically installed the, like, pattern recognizer or the intervention strategy, right?
Right, I have a couple more questions and then I'll open it up.
Yeah.
So just want to jump ahead and give everyone a lot of time. So you run a lot of events. You call them social experiments. Like, actually, Tom invited me to those, and like a couple doing like a game theory party or a blind taste tasting, all kind of stuff. I just want you to tell people about here because I'm sure people will be interested. Just like a leading question to those. And also I'm curious, like, what's your real goal when you're coming up with those? Just like looking for people to have, this is something like we're kind of thinking about as meetup organizers. Like, are we trying to get people to have a good time? We want people to learn stuff. Maybe I want to learn things about the group. We want to like have this build towards the project. So I'm curious how you think about your meetups.
Yeah, so the meetup that I run is called Ergo, and basically it was actually the other rationality meetup in New York for a long time. That's how it started. For 2 years, I ran it, and then invited a rational speaker, to come talk to the group. And at the end after he talked to the group, he said, "Oh, you know about the Overcoming Bias group, right?" And I'm like, "What are you talking about?" And he's like, "Oh, they're having an event tonight," and he took me over there. And Will Eden was running it at the time. And I was like, "Oh, what the hell? There's another rationality group? That's so weird." Literally 2 years we had not identified each other. It's kind of funny. So so that's kind of like the origin story. But what happened is, so it was a group that had the theme of science, rationality, and philosophy. That was the focus of it. And did that for years. But basically, I eventually became bored with the format, because I basically was like, we have lectures, we have group discussions. I don't feel like they're really impacting people in like super substantial ways. Also, you can now go online and just like hear a lecture about anything in the world, like, and you can watch it in your pajamas, like, we're really adding that much value. And so basically what that led me to do is think about, like, what are all the formats you could use? So I started investigating, and I tried to find every format I could. I was able to find 47 formats for bringing people together, and I have a blog post about it, if you're curious. Okay, after that, I was like, oh wow, this is interesting. There's a lot more possibilities than I'd realized. But even these 47 formats, a lot of them are pretty boring too. So then, basically what I did is set a new rule for our group, which is we're never allowed to repeat the same format ever. And so then ever since, I feel like it's just massively improved ever since we set that rule. And for, so my motivations are mixed. Like, I just find it really fun. I view it almost like as a weird art form that's like a hobby of mine, which is come up with a new set of rules to bring people together that produces like positive things, which could be bonding, it could be learning, it could be learning by yourself. Like, so that's kind of how I think about it. But also, I do think it's an interesting way to learn about human nature. Like, that's not my primary motivation, but I do try to pay attention to that. Like we ran this game theory one, for example, where we had people play a series of escalating game theory games. Jacob actually wrote a blog post about it, which was cool. And it really surprised me, some of the things that happened there. For example, like maybe this is obvious in retrospect, but I totally didn't expect, people started working around the rules in weird ways. Like, for example, there was a group of people who would never defect. And what they would try to do is they would try to tell each other about who the defectors were. And then they would like corner themselves in the corner of the room and not let the defectors near them. And sometimes when people would defect, other people would just shout at the top of their lungs, like, that person defected on me. And so, that's like an example where I feel like I learned something about humans that day. And so I really enjoy that aspect as well.
Right. Do you ever run the group statistics one? Because last week the meetup was, I just stole an idea from Spencer's list.
I haven't run that one. Was it good?
Yeah, it was awesome. So we made like a twist in it. So
okay, sweet. Yeah,
I can run it for your group now. We have like the good format.
Oh, sweet. Oh, great. Yeah,
right.
Awesome.
I have like a last question before I open it up to everybody. If everybody doesn't have question, I have like 10 more. So you're running a startup foundry, you're writing for clear thinking, you're doing your own research, machine learning stuff, you're running events. And that just seems like, I don't know, more than like most people are capable of doing in a 24-hour day. So I have two questions in this. One is like the Tyler Cowen question, which is, what's the Spencer Greenberg productivity function? Like, what is it about your skills, your background, that allows you to be good at the things you do? And then the Tim Ferriss question, like, what are some tips we can steal to do more of all this stuff? Because this is all stuff we're interested in.
Well, actually, so one reason that I believe in self-help as like a thing is because like I've had a few very specific, concrete, self-helpy things that just like massively improve my life or my ability to achieve the things I care about. And I think they're often different for different people, but like one of the biggest ones ever for me was that for many years I would not finish projects. Like I would start a project, I'd be really excited about it, I'd work on it for a while, they would be hard and difficult, it would become less shiny as I got into details and it became more boring, and then something else shiny would come along. This was a huge problem and I wasted a huge amount of time. And then I figured out a hack that just like completely solved the problem in one fell swoop. And for me, it's not going to be true for everyone certainly, but for me the hack was every project there has to be someone else depending on me in it. And if someone else is depending on me to do my part, then I will never stop. So then boom, I like solved that problem and I was like, oh shit, now I just don't stop projects. And I can spend easily 6 years working on something that like and not give up. I think 10 years, maybe 20 years. So that was huge. And so that for me, that like changed my life. Another thing that for me is just that I feel this like just huge obligation to try to devote a significant amount of my energy to making the world suck less. I don't necessarily feel like I have to like literally maximize my impact on the universe, but I do feel this really strong obligation. And so that causes me to push myself really hard. So I work more than probably